Okay, I think we're ready to start. So I see you guys have been very busy with 2 days of back-to-back sessions. I'm impressed you're still going, and some of you are still awake. But you know, when I'm speaking, I like to understand the audience that I'm speaking to. So if I could just see a show of hands regarding which of you are actually currently entrepreneurs. A show of hands for entrepreneurs in the room. Okay. So which of you are working at startups? 1, 2. Okay, which of you are thinking of being entrepreneurs or working at startups? So the rest is from military intelligence, or? Okay, great. So continuing on the people that answered yes or raised their hands to one of these questions, you know, which of you here have, for the entrepreneurs, have a role model in terms of a company that's a startup, that's Egyptian, that you know you want your startup to be like that, to have the same success that that Egyptian startup has had? If you could raise your hand if that applies to you. If there's a company, Egyptian startup role model that you look up to and you want your company to be like that. Great. Well, that's very in line, I think, with the topic of my session. You know, if we, you know, we don't have a single role model company that has come up to the audience here, that I think shows us that, you know, the Egyptian entrepreneurial activity has been quite hyped up relative to what is actually happening. And what I want to discuss today is, you know, do a quick reality check on that, and then establish perhaps what are the main factors of why the activity and the results have not been on par with our expectations and our dreams for this community. So the first thing, you know, to establish is that there are very, very, very few Egyptian startups that have been successful. And I think, you know, the poll that I just made is a reflection of that. And the second thing is, not only are very few successful, but the ones that succeed have very, very, very limited success. Okay? And I'm not talking about percentages in terms of, 5% of them succeed or 5% have limited success, because those percentages are consistent around the world. We know that in any country, a very small percent of startups succeed. So it's not an Egyptian phenomenon. I'm talking about it in absolute numbers, not in percentages. So in the sense of, maybe if we're talking in the US or in Europe, if we have tens of thousands of startups succeed, in Egypt, it's at best case scenario in the tens of startups, not tens of thousands. If it's that, you know, every year we have tens that succeed. And I think regarding the main factors of why that's the case, of why we've had a very small number of successful startups in Egypt, and those that have succeeded have had very, very little and limited success, is because if you look at just the general business environment in Egypt, it's extremely harsh. I mean, people who have built successful business in Egypt, I mean, power to them. I mean, these are people that, I mean, the ones that have done it in an honorable and fashion. It is something that requires a lot of work and a lot of endurance, and that part gets lost in the glory and the celebration of having, you know, people who have the outcome of which have become very rich and very influential, and people only look at that part. They don't look at the struggles of it. So in Egypt, you know, everyone knows here, you know, has a low ranking in doing business. You know, the ranking around the world, it's maybe 150 out of 200 countries or something like that, because you have a high level of corruption, you have a high level of bureaucracy. If you need to go to courts to honor your contracts, that takes years. The general doing business is tough. But that is not yet the main factor of why we have limited success in startups. because that will come in for startups that maybe have had revenues in the millions of dollars to growing to tens and hundreds of millions of dollars. That's a challenge that they're going to see and feel, and it's going to be a point that's going to be a blocking point for them. But we're talking about going from idea to establishing a business with, you know, a few $100,000 in revenue, with, you know, a few $1 million in revenue. And for that part, there are other factors. But this is a factor that I want to start with to establish, because it is going to be a major bottleneck for growing the SME sector generally around the country. And as we know, it's the SME sector that creates jobs. It's the one that drives economic growth. And as long as we have a very harsh environment for doing business, and we're not addressing that in Egypt, we're going to have, you know, a hard time creating a large number of jobs and creating significant economic growth. Now, going back to my discussion on the factors of why these startups haven't been successful. You know, the main reason is most of them are simply not ready to create a company. You know, the entrepreneurship and startups have become so fashionable lately that we take it very lightly. Like, oh, I'm just gonna start a company. You know, if you want to become a doctor, if you want to become a lawyer, if you want to become an engineer, you have to study for that for years. You have to prepare for that. You have to go and get experience and working experience in that field. But when you talk about entrepreneurship, you know, you can just start a company like that out of nowhere. And so we get lost, and I've seen a lot of people get lost in the hype where they actually think that they're entrepreneurs because, you know, they have a business card that says CEO, and, you know, they put up a website that costs, you know, $200 template to put together that says the company and here's the address. And we forget about building tangible business that are, you know, have competitive products that can compete nationally or globally with competitive cost structures and significant revenues, you know, that are growing. And so I think in Egypt, there is currently a big gap in, you know, having a factory that's producing youth and entrepreneurs who are capable of starting successful companies, because that is know-how, that is knowledge, that is experience. You can't just overnight become a successful entrepreneur out of nowhere. Really, it's 1 in a million in terms of people who are just born natural entrepreneurs. And from my first company right off the first bat, it was extremely successful and I made a lot of money. That's 1 in a million, literally. But for the rest, if you look at any successful communities that are entrepreneurial hubs like Silicon Valley, for instance, you know, people who become established and successful entrepreneurs, they spent a large amount of their career working at other startups, building their experience there, seeing, you know, how do you raise money from investors successfully, and how do you negotiate term sheets? How do you build a competitive supply chain? You know, looking at, you know, successful market penetration strategies, just learning from the founders of companies that are their employers and working from 1, 2, 3, 4 companies, and then after building enough experience, then they can think about going and starting their own company. Now, because in Egypt we do not have the same amount of clout in terms of successful startups in large numbers, there's very little opportunities and rooms for youth to go and develop that type of experience so that they can start, you know, their own companies. And so even the ones that have spent a few years working at other startups, building experience, they still have a large probability of failure, and most of them still fail. So imagine the ones that are just going off the bat, starting companies with no experience whatsoever in that field or in building companies in general. What are their chances of success? And that's exactly what has led to the result that we're in today. You know, the second factor is the media. And, you know, the media, I'm talking about, you know, industry media, international media, because we have very little time of Egyptian media that covers entrepreneurship. It's mostly football, politics, and Turkish soap operas, as we all know. And now that Ramadan is coming, we have a lot more content coming. So I'm talking about, you know, the industry media. If you're someone that's thinking about starting a company, you live in Egypt, and you're reading TechCrunch and reading all those industry news portals, every single day you're getting in your news feed, you know, this startup raised $50 million. You know, this startup raised an evaluation at $10 billion. It's just you're bombarded with it on a constant rate that it like relative starts looking, oh, you know, everyone, it's easy, it's doable. And so that perception over time is what leads to someone overnight deciding to, you know, I'm gonna start a company, I'm gonna be an entrepreneur today, yet you know, and not realizing that they actually don't have any experience in the space. They haven't built the necessary resume and toolkit of skills that they need that can help them on this journey that they're about to embark on. You know, but the media only covers the a very thin layer of the story. You're seeing the cherry on top. You know, for these entrepreneurs to get there, they have went through multiple rounds of failures, multiple, rounds of being turned down, 20 hours of work a day, working weekends for years, a lot of sweat and tears and blood, and then at the end, a small percentage of them have seen the success. And so, people are attracted to entrepreneurship now because they're seeing that glamorous angle, and that's the biggest lie in history. Entrepreneurship is not glamorous. Entrepreneurship is a very lonely craft. Okay, you're working day and night. There's no work hours, there's no weekends, there's no holidays if action calls, right? If you're the CEO, you're the guy that's working on the worst problems ever, because you're working on the problems that the rest of the team can't solve, so they bring it to you. So you're constantly working on, that. So, sorry?
You work on the most critical issues, actually.
Yeah, and so that's just completely different and a complete mirror image from the perception that's being given, and people are attracted to that out of college because they want to be a CEO and they think it's cool and all that. Now, I think another factor, regarding Egypt for why we've had very, very little startups that have become successful, and the ones that have succeeded have had limited success. And I repeat that as many times so you can have it engraved in your minds when you're leaving this session, is because most of the efforts that have happened to try to create successful startups have simply emulated and copied Silicon Valley models, right? So something that's been very popular since the revolution is these accelerator models, modeled after Y Combinator and Techstars. You've seen a lot of them pop up, not just in Egypt, but all over the Middle East. And what the point I see that missing is building companies or building startups in Silicon Valley or in the US is completely different from building companies in China, is completely different from building companies in Brazil, is completely different from building companies in Egypt. So you can't just copy paste Y Combinator, bring it to Egypt under another name, and then overnight you're gonna have hundreds of successful startups worth tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, right? Because in the US, the companies that are going through Y Combinator and Techstars are companies that are vetted and screened at extremely high level. You're really getting the cream of the crop out of an originally competitive pool. And so the companies that are going into these programs are ones that, I said at the beginning, have a lot of this eligible criteria of they've either started companies before that have succeeded, or tried starting multiple companies that failed, or worked at multiple startups such as Dropbox or any of the big celebrated startups, and they've seen the founders early on how they've built the businesses, right? And then when you sort of add additional support to them and network them and all that, then you've helped them become successful. But in Egypt, you don't have that layer. In Egypt, you're starting with a pool that's extremely underdeveloped, that has not had, and that's at no fault to them. I'm not stabbing at the entrepreneurs here, and you expect that these people who have no entrepreneurial experience whatsoever, that if you give them £100,000, organize some fancy dinners and give them office space, that they're suddenly going to become worth millions of dollars, and you're going to have thousands of these startups all over Egypt. And so we need to look at what entrepreneurs in Egypt are missing and what is the cluster of entrepreneurship here missing, and craft programs that are catered to that, because the problems that we have here are different from the problems that European startups have, are different from Australian startups, are different from Mexican startups. And so there's no baseball hat, one size fit all. Now, I want to, before I open it up for questions, just close by mentioning that if you want to be an entrepreneur, as most of the people in this room raise their hands for that question, it's something that is very fulfilling and very rewarding from a fulfillment point of view. But you just have to do it at the right time, with the right people, and just having the passion, having the vision, wanting to make a big impact, wanting to do something different, are all virtues that are very respectable. But at the end of the day, you're creating a business, okay? And so when you're creating a business, you're being critiqued with a lens of what are your financials looking like? How can you grow these financials to how profitable is this company? How do you compare it to your competitors? So if you're not in a position to deliver a business that has very high financial performance and very good financial results, then you need to pivot or reconsider your business plan or rebuild the team, because that is the nucleus of entrepreneurship at the end of the day. It's not a non-for-profit, right? Now, there is a program that I started back in 2007 when entrepreneurship wasn't as popular, called Spark Ventures. And we had a little bit of hiatus in 2011, but we relaunched the program this year. And I'm actually announcing here the relaunch of the college program. So, what the program does is it focuses on building entrepreneurial character and building entrepreneurial thinking in high school and college students, right? Because that's what I talked about early on as the main bottleneck for why we're not seeing successful results, is we don't have people that are capable of, that had the training to build successful and profitable companies from scratch. And so if you're an entrepreneur and or you want to be an entrepreneur and you're looking for that experience that can make up for things that we discussed that's missing, I suggest that you check it out in case it interests you. The website is called sparkentrepreneurs.com, and if you're in high school, which I don't see any here, sparkentrepreneurs.com. Spark, as making the spark in youth. And if you're in high school, it's sparksummercamp.com. Yeah. And with that, I want to thank you for coming, and we'll open up and take any questions in the last 2 minutes that we have. Please.
One of the things that you mentioned is about catering to the specific challenges that the Egyptian entrepreneurs face. Can you give us an example to some of the things that entrepreneurship support programs can do for these challenges? Is it sector specific or a general?
Sure. I think, as I mentioned, entrepreneurship at the end of the day is about starting profitable companies, right? And so, the one thing that overlaps with all sectors is, it's business skills, right? It's negotiation skills, it's fundraising skills, it's recruiting skills. And so these are all things that, people need to be trained at, before they become entrepreneurs. If you're joining a company, you're playing a very specific technical role, yeah, perhaps you don't need those skills. But if you're the founder of the company and you're the one that's given the flag and you're that's going to grow it from zero revenue to $100 million of revenue or anything on that order of magnitude, these are skills that you need to have. And currently, if you go and get a bachelor's of anything, you don't get those skills from academia. And so, as I mentioned, you usually get them by working at startups that put you in an environment or you have to learn on the go and develop them the hard way, or learn from your peers and from your managers. But again, because we don't have those large plethora of successful startups, you don't have the opportunity to learn it by being in Egypt. And so that's why we have Spark, which is basically, it's a program that teaches you these types of skills. Please. Sure. Well, I think we need to take it one step at a time, and it's good to start early. Starting from when people are still in school, whether it's in high school or in college, and having programs that are focusing on developing the character and developing the thinking, as opposed to taking a business that's already formed and saying, okay, how can we help that business? Your impact will go much further if you focus on talent development and human development, because then you have a fabric that you can do a lot more with. It's a lot richer, and it's a lot easier to work with, and you have to teach them less and they can learn more on their own. So it's the type of education that we deal with here. If you look at obviously all government education, I think it's better off that high school students and college students that are in government schools stay at home and not have any education, as opposed to going and enrolling to these entities. As of today, I think it's that bad, because today you learn every day and you don't need a school to learn. You can research, you can use the internet, and so spending your time having that type of hands-on experience is much more valuable than reading the government textbooks and taking their exam. Obviously, that's an extreme opinion, but it's just to put in context how disconnected our curriculums in Egypt have become from the reality and from the needs of the marketplace. I mean, the reason there's really high unemployment in Egypt is because the universities are not producing talent with the skills that are required by the market, right? Absolutely. Absolutely. More questions, please?
I'd like to ask you kindly mention 3 points, okay, make you a successful executive. And how you select your team, to select.
3 points that make you a successful executive. I think the first and most important point is you have to bring the best out of your team, in the sense of people, as a leader, people rely on you to lead, and leading not in the sense of the guy that gets the seat at the head of the table, but more in constantly motivating the team, letting them see the big picture, having them, ignite the passion inside of them, make motivated to go to work every day, wake out, get out of bed to solve these problems and achieve these goals. And I think that's the most important thing, because if your organization is not running and buzzing with that level of energy, then you're operating at a really low efficiency factor or capacity factor. That's the first thing. The second thing, you kind of alluded to it, it's all about the team. I mean, your company is as good as the quality of the people that are in it. And so if you're not constantly nurturing that team, developing their skills and giving them more exposure and constantly recruiting the best of the best that you have access to, you're always going to be producing less results than you can. And the third thing, again, I kind of alluded to indirectly, is if you're an executive of a business, at the end of the day, it's your bottom line. You're a business. You need to present profits to your shareholders at the end of the day. And so you need to be focused on that, and you need to be extremely transparent on that regarding with your results, with your guidances, etc. So thank you very much for coming to the session. I hope you enjoyed it and enjoy the rest of the day.